The most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Ronald Reagan.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here, and today we'll take a look at the development of contemporary American politics. Now, between 1933 and 1980, the Democratic Party maintained steady control of the federal government. The New Deal coalition, assembled by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the throes of the Great Depression, brought blue-collar workers, white Southerners, racial minorities, and even some farmers into the fold of the Democratic Party. But in 1980, that coalition was dismantled by a charismatic California governor named Ronald Reagan, who built and solidified the modern Republican Party. Historians note that Reagan's election ushered in a new age in American politics, one defined by conservatism. Today, we'll look at this conservative age, and we'll try to answer a big question. Are we still in the age of conservatism? The tricky thing about contemporary history is that it isn't really history. You see, we historians love hindsight. We prefer to withhold our conclusions until the long-term effects of historical developments can be fully examined. So any attempt to pinpoint our current location within broader historical trends is slightly problematic. Still, it's fun to try. So let's take a look at the age of conservatism and see what parallels we can draw to the world around us. Our first big idea traces the causes of the shift towards the Republican Party and conservative politics in the 1970s and 1980s. The social unrest of the 1960s and 70s, combined with an economic downturn and rising mistrust in government, spurred a conservative backlash in the 1980s and beyond. At its core, conservative thought in the late 20th century emphasized limited government, fiscal responsibility, low taxes, traditional social values, and a hawkish foreign policy. And during the 60s and 70s, conservative movements garnered momentum for a number of reasons. For one, the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal had badly damaged Americans' trust in the federal government. Conservative calls for a reduction of the government thus resonated with many voters. Second, the 1970s had witnessed a sharp economic downturn, which conservatives blamed on decades of government spending on social programs. Third, the social unrest of the 60s and 70s generated a backlash among the so-called silent majority, who rejected hippie culture and the civil rights movements. This older, mostly white contingent favored a return to traditional values, which they believed had been corrupted by America's youth. Fourth, the landmark Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, as well as the gay liberation movement of the 70s, mobilized evangelical Christians to political arenas, especially in the Gulf South, where conservative Christians called for their politicians to uphold religious values. And finally, the Iran hostage crisis and Soviet aggression in Afghanistan in the late 70s led many Americans to believe that the United States was losing its edge as a global superpower, emboldening politicians who called for more aggressive foreign policy decisions. Thus, the stage was set for a conservative resurgence in the 1980s. The Republican Party was poised to seize power, and they did so on the back of the charismatic leadership of Ronald Reagan. This is our second big idea. Ronald Reagan embodied the values of contemporary conservatives, and he became the banner carrier for the modern conservative movement. In 1980, Reagan dismantled the New Deal coalition and reshaped the Republican Party for decades to come. Republicans recognized an opportunity in the late 70s. They successfully characterized Jimmy Carter as a weak president, and for his part, Carter hadn't done much to disprove the charge. For the 1980 presidential election, Republicans nominated former Hollywood actor and governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Reagan checked all the conservative boxes. He used his national notoriety as an actor in Western films to play up a cowboy persona that appealed to rural white Americans. He talked openly about patriotism and lamented a perceived decline in American pride during the 60s and 70s. He took traditional positions on social issues and touted himself as a proponent of states' rights, limited government, and economic deregulation. At his core, Reagan embraced individualism and self-determination. He was also a charismatic and effective communicator, which won him favor among educated and non-educated voters alike. Reagan's message resonated across the country, and in 1980, he effectively dismantled FDR's New Deal coalition, reshaping the Republican Party in his own image. Reagan's coalition consisted of three main groups. First, wealthy Americans and industry leaders favored Reagan's economic approach, which promised lower taxes and less government regulation of business. Second, rural voters in the West and South were drawn to Reagan's individualism and hawkish approach to communism and the Cold War. But the most significant of Reagan's voting bloc was white Southerners, whom he managed to peel away from the Democratic Party by appealing to their evangelical Christian sensibilities. You'll recall that white people in the South had long been loyal Democrats, dating back to the antebellum period. But with the issue of segregation largely settled by the 1970s, white Southerners needed a new issue to rally around. The Republicans found such an issue in evangelical Christianity. To this day, the Gulf South remains the most religious region in the United States, and the religious scene there is dominated by conservative Protestantism. Reagan and the Republicans appealed to Southern Christians by speaking out against the social movements of the 70s, including gay liberation and abortion rights. Republicans' conservative stances on these issues have largely kept the South in Republican hands ever since. So now that we've seen how conservatism rose to prominence in the United States, let's take a look at how it manifested in federal policy. Here's our third big idea. With a few noteworthy exceptions, the presidencies of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush were dominated by conservative politics. Once in office, Ronald Reagan acted quickly to make good on his campaign promises, especially when it came to the economy and the Cold War. As we discussed in the last lecture, military spending exploded under Reagan, and the United States took a more adversarial position against communism around the world. Domestically, Reagan followed through on his promise to cut taxes and deregulate the American economy. He allowed large businesses to consolidate, lifted restrictions on the banking industry, eased safety and efficiency standards for automakers, and opened federal land to the coal, oil, and timber industries. Reagan also cut taxes, employing what his administration called trickle-down economics. These tax cuts largely favored the rich, but the prevailing conservative belief was that tax benefits for the wealthy would trickle down to the middle and working classes in the form of more jobs and better salaries. It's worth noting that while the tax cuts and deregulation did spur meaningful economic growth in the 1980s, recent scholarship indicates that the benefits did not trickle down to the lower classes as predicted. Reagan cut more than $40 billion from welfare and other social programs, but thanks to the tax cuts and the new military spending, the budget deficit actually rose during his presidency, and the national debt increased fourfold. Now, despite some underlying economic issues, the United States generally experienced prosperity during the 1980s, cementing Ronald Reagan as an icon for modern conservatives. In 1988, his vice president and chosen successor, George H.W. Bush, was elected president, presumably to carry on Reagan's legacy. But Bush's presidency, while successful in foreign affairs, was mostly uneventful. And when a recession in 1990 forced him to raise taxes against his campaign promise, hardcore conservatives turned on the first President Bush. Sensing the mood of the country in 1992, the Democratic Party nominated a charming Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton for president. Democrats hoped that by nominating a Southerner, they might reverse the exodus of white Southerners from their party. And it worked. Kind of. Clinton won in 1992, but mainly because a conservative third-party candidate named Ross Perot split the Republican vote. And while the Democrats took control of the White House, Clinton had to contend with a conservative Congress. So, as far as Democratic presidencies go, the results of Clinton's generally favored conservatives, proving that the conservative age was still very much alive. Several examples explain. Despite the fact that Clinton introduced new social programs like the Family and Medical Leave Act, the federal budget operated in a surplus for the first time since 1969, satisfying fiscal conservatives who had lamented the pattern of deficit spending that began in earnest during the Great Depression. Conservatives in Congress blocked Clinton's attempt to pass a universal health care program, protecting the private insurance industry and the free market. Conservatives also forced Clinton to compromise on social issues. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, instituted during the Clinton administration, stopped invasive inquiries about the sexual orientation of American soldiers, but it still permitted the military to expel gay people if they served openly. Clinton also signed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which limited the federal definition of marriage to heterosexual unions and opened the door for states to ban gay marriage outright. President Clinton also advanced some conservative measures of his own accord. In exchange for a ban on assault rifle sales, Clinton's 1994 anti-crime bill increased funding for law enforcement by over $30 billion. Clinton's second term was defined by political gridlock, as Republican majorities in Congress blocked his efforts to advance liberal policy goals. The second term was also mired by a White House sex scandal, which ultimately led to Clinton's impeachment. And though the president was acquitted in the Senate, the trial drained most of his political capital. The millennial year 2000 witnessed the election of Republican George W. Bush, a Texas governor and the son of former President George H.W. Bush. The younger Bush's presidency saw the continuation of many conservative policies. Inheriting as they did a budget surplus, Republicans took a page from the Reaganomics playbook by passing sweeping tax cuts, especially for the wealthy. And the American economy remained largely deregulated, especially the banking system, which had undergone significant changes thanks to the technological advances of recent decades. This underregulation ultimately led to rapid growth in the early 2000s, but also a massive economic downturn when the housing market crashed in 2008. Bush's presidency was also defined by a hawkish approach to foreign policy. Springboarded by the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, America's military presence in the Middle East and Central Asia expanded significantly. Wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq drove up military spending, increasing the national debt and deficit. When Bush left office in 2009, the country was in the throes of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and it was conducting two insurgent wars that were quickly drawing comparisons to Vietnam. Because of this, George W. Bush left office with extremely low approval ratings, and voters across the country turned out to call for change. In 2008, they elected a rising star in the Democratic Party, a junior senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. Aside from becoming the nation's first black president, Obama's election represents a turning point in the age of conservatism. But did his election signal the end of that era? Here's our final big idea. Following the presidency of George W. Bush, Democrats claimed 3 of the next 4 presidential elections. However, conservative politics still factored heavily into national policymaking. Barack Obama won the presidency by positioning himself as the candidate for change. Democrats recognized the widespread discontent with George W. Bush, and they convinced voters that the Republican nominee, Arizona Senator John McCain, would bring more of the same. And at the time of his election, Obama was probably the most liberal-minded Democratic president since Lyndon B. Johnson. But his policies didn't necessarily bear that out. His major legislative victory, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was but a shadow of the universal health care plan he originally envisioned. And after the 2010 midterms, Obama's efforts were largely blocked by Republican congressional majorities. Frustrated by the Republicans' obstructionism in Congress, Obama attempted to enact policy through executive order, most notably the DACA immigration policy. But many of these efforts backfired. Many of Obama's executive orders were easily overturned by the succeeding administration, and they fueled Republicans' claims that the president was seizing power for the executive branch and acting against the will of the American people. After 2 relatively uneventful but still divisive Obama terms, self-proclaimed real estate mogul and reality TV star Donald Trump took the Republican Party by storm and recaptured the White House for the Republicans. He defeated the former First Lady, New York Senator, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2016. Trump's election proved that conservative politics still resonated with millions of Americans. However, the nature of American conservatism underwent notable changes during Trump's presidency. Trump's campaign channeled the memory of Ronald Reagan with the campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." And President Trump appealed to fiscal conservatives through sweeping corporate tax cuts and deregulation. But Trump broke the mold of the traditional American conservative. Trump was twice divorced, and accusations of sexual misconduct were ubiquitous during his campaign. Still, he managed to hold evangelicals in the Gulf South for the Republican Party, largely through pro-life and pro-gun rhetoric. Trump also built a cult of personality with rural and blue-collar voters, many of whom he peeled away from the Democratic Party in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Indeed, Trump's intense popularity in rural America allowed him to replace Ronald Reagan as the face, voice, and aura of the Republican Party. But Trump's bombastic and confrontational persona did not play as well in the American suburbs, which had traditionally been a stronghold for Republicans. This, combined with his handling of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and a resurgence of racial unrest in the same year, ultimately led to his ousting in the 2020 election. Ultimately, history has yet to decide whether the age of conservatism ended with Obama, Trump, or Joe Biden, and it's possible that it's still ongoing. Recent Democratic victories in national elections seem to suggest a turning of the tide, but across the nation, state legislatures remain largely in Republican control. The Supreme Court tilts hard to the right thanks to 3 Trump appointees, and state-level challenges to abortion and gender equality are gaining momentum. The balance of power in Congress would also suggest that Barack Obama's 8 years were more a rejection of George W. Bush than of conservative principles. And perhaps the same can be said of Joe Biden, who seized on Trump's unpopularity with moderates in 2020. If the age of conservatism is yet ongoing, we'll need more time to fully see it. If it is over, the debate over America's next chapter can begin. Next time, we'll look at American foreign policy in the 21st century, particularly in the Islamic world. See you then.